to a lot of this picturing of Jesus Christ. It's all like a transformer, same parts, same pieces, but different manifestations. As you go through the Gospels, they're very particular about their presentations of Christ. Sometimes he's pictured as a lion. Sometimes he's pictured as an ox. Sometimes he's pictured as a man. Sometimes he's pictured as an eagle. Sometimes he's a lamb. And as we work through the life of Christ, I want to be sure we understand the significance of these pictures because they're very powerful pictures of Jesus Christ. So I'd like to overview the Gospels and how they come to be written and the significance of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, realizing that there really is only one gospel, all right? The word gospel is the Greek that means good angel, and the word angel can also mean messenger. It's a good message, euangelion. And that one gospel basically is what you and I might call good news. Jesus Christ came to a world that was broken and full of sin. He died on the cross to forgive sins. One day when he comes and returns, he's going to make this world, the world and we dream about, the kingdom will come. And that really is good news to folks who are lost in guilt and hurting and need a Savior and a new life. That comes to us as good news. Now, I think it's not just interesting, but it's helpful to realize that the Gospels are not the only source we have about Jesus Christ and his life. For example, Flavius Josephus was the governor of Jerusalem in 60 A.D., and he wrote what's called the History of the Jews. Look at you. He did a lot of writing, tiny print. And it's a very well-known book, a very historical book from his pen. He was on Masada and died here with the folks who suicided at Masada when the Romans were getting close. But he completed pretty much all of his book long before that. And here's what he writes about the days of Pontius Pilate. Okay? Now, he was a Jew who may well have become a Christian. Now, there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, if it's faithful, lawful to call him a man. This is in book 3, paragraph 18. Book 18, paragraph 3. He was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of those who love the truth. He drew over many people to him, both Jews and Greeks, Gentiles. He was Christ. And when Pilate, at the suggestion of those who wanted, condemned him to the cross, those that loved him did not forsake him, for he appeared to them alive the third day, as the divine prophets had foretold, and the tribe of Christians, so named from Jesus, the Christ, are not extinct even to this day. Now, there's a reference to Christ. It's not in the Bible, but refers to him and to his following. The Jewish Talmud, which are basically the reflections and the teachings of the Jewish rabbis upon the scriptures, have 8 separate references to Christ. All of them condemn him, but they're intriguing to read. Numerous Roman historians wrote to us about Jesus Christ. For example, Tacitus was writing about the fire of Nero, and he gives us a picture of what was going on in those days, when all the endeavors did not suffice to stop the scandal that Nero had himself started the fire. To get rid of this rumor, Nero set up his culprits and punished those of the class known as Christians. They're called Christians from Christus, from who their name is derived. He was executed at the hands of Pontius Pilate during the reign of Tiberius. Accordingly, this is what it is. Arrest was first made of those who confessed to being Christian. And then on evidence, a whole multitude was convicted. And besides being put to death, they were made objects of amusement. They were clad in the hides of beasts and torn to death by dogs. Others were crucified. Others set on fire to illuminate the night when daylight failed. And all this gave rise to a feeling of pity, for it was felt that those being destroyed were not being destroyed for public good, but to satisfy the cruelty of Nero. Now, we could read here about Suetonius, Pliny the Younger, Roman Emperor Trajan. Pliny was wondering, what do I do with all these folks called Christians? He says, I would question them 2 or 3 times. And if they didn't recant, I'd put them to death. And he writes to the Roman Emperor Trajan and says, is that a good policy? And Trajan says, yes, here's the test. See if they'll bow down and worship me and the other idols. And if they do, you know that they must be true Christians, because the word is a true Christian could never, ever curse and turn and cry. That's interesting to read the correspondence, several letters back and forth between those two individuals. Here are all kinds of references to crimes besides just what's in the Bible. Perhaps you've heard of the pseudepigrapha. Perhaps you haven't. But the pseudepigrapha is something that would be helpful for us to know. The pseudepigrapha means false writings. Maybe recently you heard of the Gospel of Judas. Some of you heard of the Gospel of Judas being found. Look at all those things. And you wondered, as they portrayed it in the media, new revelations about Christ. What in the world is the Gospel of Judas? Well, you've heard about the Gospel of Thomas. The Gospel of Thomas was written about 175 A.D., in which there's all these pictures of Jesus. For example, Jesus and Joseph were working in the carpenter shop, and one day Joseph cuts off one of these bedboards too short. And Joseph gets all angry, and little 8-year-old Jesus says, "No, stop, Daddy, it's okay. You take one side of the board, I'll take the other." And Jesus miraculously linking it right out. Perfect sound. Gospel of Pseudo-Matthew. Jesus is sitting in synagogue stool. His teacher says something that wasn't right or criticized Jesus. Jesus struck him dead on the spot. And it raised him back to mind. And there are the stories in there of Jesus taking little birds and squishing them to death in his hands. But that was okay, because he raised them to life and they flew away. What are these things? These are things that were written by the Gnostics. Now, you may not know what the Gnostics are. It's a Greek word that means knowledge. But it's okay to learn a little bit about them, because most of these were written after 200 A.D. So when the process is, is this new revelation about Christ we can trust? You don't want to trust these things because they're written long after the first century by folks who never knew Jesus, with a hidden agenda of promoting Gnosticism. Most all of them were found in Egypt, none in the Holy Land, and they were all written in Coptic, which is an Egyptian type of language. The Gnostics had an agenda. They basically believed that Jesus Christ was just one of many spirit forms, many spirit beings that sprang forth from God and Sophia. Remember the Da Vinci Code? Sophia, the wisdom goddess? This is just plain old Gnosticism. It also taught that these spirit beings would bring special knowledge to the spiritually elite. It wasn't for everybody, but for the spiritually elite, they could get this special knowledge. This sounds like some of the religions to this day. God Almighty was not the creator. Lesser beings did the creation because God was so holy, there's part of Gnosticism, that he would never touch matter. So we had the lesser beings like Lucifer and Jesus do the creating. Now, Gnostic elements exist to a very extent in a lot of extreme charismatic groups, just described through the basic teachings of the New Age movement. And if you're familiar with Mormonism, you see some of their basic teachings come straight out of Gnosticism, had their roots with the Gnostics and all the pseudepigraphy. The pseudepigraphy means false writings. And the reason they're false is every one of them picks a prominent New Testament writer or Old Testament patron and signs their name. So the Gospel of Thomas is signed by Thomas. Only Thomas had been dead about 120 years before that book was written. And they signed Matthew's name to the Gospel of Pseudo-Matthew. That's not exactly the title they used. But that was written about 100 plus years after Matthew died. And so they're termed the pseudepigrapha. So the next time you hear the news about some new gospel that's found in Egypt, you realize what these things are. They don't even go close to the first century. They give us a very different picture of the gospel. For example, John wrote his books, and 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, in the context of Gnosticism, which was just beginning, really flowed out of a branch of Judaism back in the 1st century. That's why he emphasized Jesus Christ was not created. He was in fact God. He did the creating. And in fact, there's no secret knowledge with Christianity. Jesus Christ is the truth. He's available for anyone. That's the whole point of the Gospel of John. To all who received him, everyone who believes on his name, they get the knowledge of Christ. There's nothing secret about him. He doesn't go to the spiritually elite. But you and I will find in many of the roots of a lot of modern-day religions which trace back to them. Now I'm going to pause here and take a drink. But Steve, you'll turn my mic on. Find me again. Thank you. Excuse me for that, but that really does help. Now, We're going to go through the Gospels. The question you and I might ask is, what did Jesus look like? Wouldn't that be interesting? If you go to the Bible, there's some pictures of him. For example, in Isaiah, there's a picture of Jesus Christ, chapter 52, verse 13. Here's what Isaiah says he looked like. Just as there were many who were appalled at Jesus, his appearance was so disfigured beyond that of any man, and his form marred beyond human likeness. An awful picture of Jesus. You turn the page to chapter 53, verse 2. He had no beauty or majesty to attract us to him. Nothing in his appearance that we should, what? Receive him. He was ugly. He was marked, these folks said. Cyril of Alexandria wrote about 125 AD. He was the ugliest of all the people that had ever been born. Now, what is it? It's his Christ on the cross. And when Christ was on the cross, he looked disfigured. Nobody wanted to be with him. He was despised. This is Christ on the cross. For so the psalmist writes a prediction over in Psalm 45, you are the fairest of the sons of men, and your lips have been anointed with grace. What did he look like? In about 100 plus AD, there was a letter that appeared, known as the letter of Lentulus, who was purported to be the governor of Jerusalem. And he wrote what some folks said was the mugshot, the arrest mugshot of Jesus. How many of you have seen that famous picture by Holman Hunt of Jesus? Put it up there on the screen. How many of you have seen that famous picture? Of course, now they don't use that much. People have a rugged individual Jesus, beard, and a tough guy look, and a rugged man. Lentulus wrote a description of the physical appearance of Christ, and Holman Hunt used that description to paint this picture up there on the screen. I'll read you what Lentulus wrote about the appearance of Christ. There's appeared here in our time and still lives here a man of great power named Jesus Christ. The people call him a prophet of truth. His disciples call him the Son of God. He has a venerable face, of a sort to arouse both love and fear in those who see him. His hair is the color of ripe chestnuts, smooth almost to the ears, but above them waving and curling, with a slight bluish radiance. It flows down over his shoulders. It's parted in the middle on the top of his head after the fashion of the people of Nazareth. His brow is smooth and very calm, with a face without wrinkle or blemish, lightly tinged with red. His nose, his mouth are full. His beard is luxurious and unclipped, of the same color as his hair, not long, parted at the chin. His eyes are expressive and brilliant. He is terrible in reproof, sweet and gentle in admonition, cheerful without ceasing to be grave. He's never been seen to laugh, but also often to weep. His figure is slender and erect. His hands and arms are beautiful to see. His conversation is serious, sparing, and modest. He's the fairest of the children of men. Now, that was probably a 40, but it may have embodied some basic traditional truths about what Christ looked like. Although you can say this, more than likely he was no higher than 5'3" tall. He had olive-colored skin, brown hair, brown eyes, and a rather round face. Or you say that because when they go to the first century archaeological tells and they find skeletons and all in the first century, most of the men are around 5'3" tall. They didn't have much food. They didn't grow very tall. And they had olive skin. They were of that Middle Eastern texture with brown eyes and brown hair. And the point is, Jesus looked like everybody else. There was nothing about Jesus that made him stand out. He didn't look different from anybody else of his culture or his generation, which probably was good. He came here as the humble God in a body who looked just like that. It may be that we are with Augustine, who had to say as to the appearance of Christ, we are utterly deep. We just flat out don't. But other four Gospels we'll focus on a little bit. And the four Gospels have a very singular message. They're all writing about the same thing, about the person of Jesus Christ. They're not biographies, because the first 30 years of his life is basically silent. They focus about the first 2/3 of each Gospel on the last 3 years of his life, And then the last third is about the last week. And the reason is they give us just enough who he is and what he did to prepare us for the trial, the death, the burial, and the resurrection, which is the essence of the flow of every single gospel. Now, they write different transformation pictures of Christ. When you read the Bible, there are full pictures of heaven. And each picture of heaven pictures the throne, and you can't really see what God looks like, but it's like a white light shining out into eternity. And there's a sea of glass, of crystal ice. Every gospel, every writer who sees heaven pictures. And there's also an interesting picture of an individual who's by the throne. Ezekiel described it in Ezekiel chapter 1. Here are prophetic pictures of Christ. And in the center of the fire, which looked like glowing metal, and in the fire was what looked like 4 living creatures. In appearance, their form was like a what? A man, but each of them had 4 faces and 4 wings, verse 10. And their faces looked like its. Each of the 4 had the face of a man, and the right side had the face of a lion, and the left side was the face of an ox, and it also had the face of an eagle. All right, we got 4 animals there. Now go to Revelation, chapter 4, another picture into heaven. John writes, also before the throne there was what looked like a sea of glass, clear as crystal. In the center around the throne were 4 living creatures. They were covered with eyes in front and eyes in back, verse 7. And the first living creature was like a lion, and the second was like an ox, and the third was like the face of a man, and the fourth was a picture of a flying eagle. And notice the same animals. So notice the order. You got a lion, you got an ox, you got a man, you got an eagle. Now let's look at this more carefully. These are pictures of the transformation focuses of the person of Jesus Christ. When you read the Gospel of Matthew, you read it with the framework that Matthew is giving us the picture of the lion, the king of beasts. And Matthew writes about Jesus as being the king. Mark, represented by the ox, gives the picture of Christ as a servant, and the main picture of Christ in the Gospel of Mark is a servant. Luke, the face of a man, gives us the picture of the human side of Jesus, and John is very careful to give us the picture of the eagle, of the divinity, of the godhood of Jesus Christ. So when you read the Gospels, it's helpful to keep some of these themes in mind. For example, only 2 Gospels have a Christmas story and 2 don't have a Christmas story. Matthew has a Christmas story. It's from Joseph's side of the family. It's about the king, and all kings have fascinating stories about their birth. Luke has a Christmas story. It's from Mary's side of the family, and there's shepherds and praises and mangers that Matthew never mentions. There is no Christmas story in Mark. Who cares about the birth of a slave, a servant? And there's no Christmas story in John because Jesus has always been there. He's God. Only 2 of these Gospels have genealogy. Matthew has a genealogy because you've got the record of the genealogy of the king. And Luke has a genealogy because it's the record of the genealogy up through Mary's line of the humanity of Christ. And Mark has no genealogy. Who cares where a servant came from? And John has no genealogy because God's always been there. Now let's look a little more carefully at some of these things. The Gospels are divided into 2 broad divisions. If you've read your Gospels a little bit, you know that Matthew, Mark, and Luke are a whole lot alike. And John's not like the other 2 at all. And so the first 3 are called, they're called the synoptics. The word synopsis means to see with, to see together. And Matthew, Mark, and Luke all look at the life of Christ from the same viewpoint. And John, it's like he's on another planet as he's looking at the life of Christ in a very different way. Well, how do we get these doctrines? Now, I want you to imagine that Mark's sitting down to write Mark. And let's talk about it. It's about 60 AD. And see, they expected the imminent return of Christ. He could come at any moment. But it's been 30, 35 years since crucifixion. And the eyewitnesses are dying out. Mark said, somebody better write this down. So Mark writes Mark. What did he use for his source? Some of the early church fathers tell us very simply that he just took one of Peter's sermons and copied one of Peter's sermons. Papias tells that, 130 A.D. Irenaeus, 180 A.D., said Mark transmitted to us in writing the things that Peter preached. And if you read Peter's sermon in Acts chapter 10 to Cornelius, you will find a perfect outline of Peter's sermon. What Mark used to write his gospel. We have there the preaching of Christ. Although there's no teaching in Mark, there are no parables in Mark. Now, each of these gospels has a main theme in Mark. It's servant. There's also personal lessons about each writer. The personal lesson that comes to us about Mark is he's presenting Christ as a servant. He pictures himself as one. I want to read to you Mark's signature. Every one of the gospel writers put in there a reference about themselves. Mark put in his reference in Mark chapter 14. Judas has just kissed Jesus. The Roman soldiers are leading Jesus away. And why in the world would he put these two lines in his book? That's what he writes. A young man wearing nothing but a linen garment was following Jesus. When they seized him, he fled naked, leaving his garment behind. Now, why would he put that in? That's his signature. Mark was about 18 years old. He was following the trial, the crucifixion on the way of Jesus, and one of the soldiers got it, grabbed his coat, and flipped it away and ran away naked. That was John Mark. The story of John Mark is one of failure to finally succeed. That's the lesson of his life. He went with Paul and Barnabas on the first missionary journey, and when they came to Asia Minor and he saw the mountains and Paul had malaria, John Mark said, "Man, I've had enough. I'm going home." And Paul and Barnabas couldn't believe he left them in the lurch, but he did. And when it came time for the second journey, Paul and Barnabas are ready to make the trip, and Barnabas says, "Let's take John Mark." And Paul says, "You kidding me? That queer, he ain't going with us." And the Bible says Barnabas and Paul had such a fight between them that they split. And Paul got Silas, and Barnabas took Mark to Cyprus. And Mark was a failure. But see, about 30 years later, when it's 65 A.D., and Paul's in prison and dying, it's cold in the winter, and he says to Timothy, "Would you send John Mark? He's a profitable man for ministry." One, because Barnabas turned him around. Profit. The story of failure. He succeeded. Kind of reminds me of Portia Nelson, who wrote her autobiography, 5 Short Chapters. Here's what she wrote. Here's a rich some of our stories. I walk down the street. There's a deep hole in the sidewalk. I fall in. I'm lost. I'm helpless. It isn't my fault. It takes me forever to get out. Chapter 2. I walk down the street. There's a deep hole in the sidewalk. I pretend I don't see it. I fall in again. I can't believe I'm in the same place. But it's not my fault. It's a long time to get out. Chapter 3. I walk down the same street. There's a deep hole in the sidewalk. I see it. I still fall in. The habit now. My eyes are open. I know who I am. It is my fault. I get out immediately. Chapter 4. I walk down the same street. There's a deep hole in the sidewalk. I walk around it. Chapter 5. I walk down a different street. That's the story of John Mark. He failed, but he did a terrific turning. That's 5 years later, 65 A.D. And Matthew sits down to write his gospel. Now, what's he got in front of him as he puts his gospel together? He began to realize there's some things that are, well, he had the gospel of Mark right, that basically Matthew follows Mark's outline. But he also had something else. He had a body of literature, whether it was written down or we don't have it today, it was oral tradition, which was a giant collection of Jesus' teachings and parables. You'll find none of these in Mark. He didn't have this. And they call it Q. Q's never been found. A Q is for the French letter quell, the word quell, which means source. And apparently Matthew sits down with quell, and he begins to write in from the collection of Jesus' sayings and parables with John Mark. But he also had some personal experiences that nobody else knew about. He wove those in. And then he had the Christmas story from Joseph's side of the family. King, frankincense, myrrh, what guys would be interested with. And he writes down the Gospel of Matthew. And when you read it, it's his life story. Matthew was a tax collector. He worked for the government. He was an accountant. So when you read Matthew, it's miracles, teachings, narrative, miracles, teachings, narrative, miracles, teachings, narrative, miracles, teachings, narrative, miracles, teachings, narrative. 5 cycles. The life of Christ in the Gospels is not necessarily chronological. He put this together because most people couldn't read and write, so they could memorize the cycle. Very organized. He left his signature. Over in Matthew chapter 9, verses 10 and 11, there's a picture of Jesus, and this was his signature. See, this is the story of his life. Matthew chapter 9. As Jesus went on from there, he saw a man named Matthew. Now, this is no other gospel, just his. And Jesus said, "Follow me," as he sat at the tax collector's booth, and Matthew got up and followed him. And while Jesus was having dinner at Matthew's house, many tax collectors and sinners came and ate with him and his disciples. And I want you to see the heart. He gets saved. He's inviting people because it's his heart. I want you to see what Jesus did. When the Pharisees saw this, they asked his disciples, "Why does your teacher eat with these tax collectors?" And Jesus said, "It's not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. I've come not to call the righteous to repent, but the sinners to." And see, that was who Matthew was. When you read about the traditions of Matthew out into the 1st century later on, he takes the gospel and he's an evangelist. He's the one who gives us the Great Commission, going to all the world. And Lynn's talked to us a lot about Matthew party, about inviting some of your friends who aren't Christians over to your house. That's what Matthew did. I kind of look at every Sunday morning, here's a party. And it's a great place to invite our friends. Just invite them to come to the party. Hear about Jesus Christ. Come and see. That's why we, 3 times a year, do one in the spotlight service. We come and see. That's the tradition of the line of Matthew. Now, about the same time, Luke sits down, and Luke's going to write the Gospel of Luke. What did he have? He obviously had read Mark. He's done a copy of Mark. He also had that same cue, a collection of sayings, because they parallel Matthew too closely. These guys probably never met. And he's got the same document cue, but he also tells us he's got personal research he did among the followers of Christ, because he wasn't there to see it firsthand. He was a Greek, lived in Greece, and Paul led him to Christ. But somewhere along the line, he goes back to Jerusalem, and he does his homework. And somewhere along the line, he gets the birth story from Mary's side of the family. Again, that's the shepherds, the star, the manger. It's the woman's side of the story. And he writes the Gospel of Luke. And remember now, Luke shows the picture of a man, the face of a man, and you and I see Jesus Christ presented as a man. He gave to us his signature. He made it up front where nobody could listen. Luke chapter 1, he tells us, listen to this. A lot of folks are taking pains now to draw up teachings about Christ, those things fulfilled among us, just as these things were handed down to us by those who were the first eyewitnesses. I didn't see this firsthand. Therefore, I carefully investigated everything from the beginning, and so I decided to go ahead and write a gospel myself and to write an orderly account, and I'm writing this to you. You like it, you're a man named Theophilus. Oh, excellent Theophilus. So you may know the certainty of the things thought about Christ. Now, Theophilus might have been a real man. Theophilus in Greek means God-loving. And what he might have been saying was, I'm writing to all the God-loving, includes them. So you'll know the certainty of the things about Jesus Christ. Now, when you read Luke, you've got to realize it's the picture of the humanity of Christ, and as a result, it's a book filled with compassion. That's the lesson from the man was he was a physician. He healed people. So what do we find in Luke? We don't find any place else. Luke tells us stories about women and children that no other gospel writers write about. Luke's the one who told us the story of the Good Samaritan. He's the only one who mentioned it. Certain man walking down the road, and he gets beat up by the thieves, and the priest and Levite go by, but the Samaritan went. There's a whole story about the compassion of that Samaritan. It's in Luke we discover Jesus said, bring all those little children. This heaven's filled like with little children. It was Luke that tells us about the lost sheep and the lost coin. Remember the woman who lost the coin? And she's weakened because she lost the coin. He tells us about the prodigal son. It's the father who's weakened because he lost the son. It's all based around compassion. He's the only one who tells us about 10 lepers. And out of the passionate heart of Jesus, he heals the leper. So when you're reading Luke, read it from the picture of a man, of humanity. You'll see the humanity of Christ. We got Matthew, Mark, and Luke written, all by 65 AD, and John. That's very different. And about 30 years later, John's about to die. Jesus told him he'd live to a ripe old age. And it's now about 95 AD. Christ was crucified about 30, 32 or 5 AD. And it's getting near the end of his life. I better write gospel. What did he have when he wrote his gospel? There's no doubt he read Matthew, Mark, and Luke, because he doesn't touch hardly a thing in those gospels. He said, I'm going to fill in the gap. And he fills in the gap with some of his personal, intimate experiences with Jesus Christ. And he tells us near the end of the gospel, now the reason I've done this, I've given you 8 signs. There are 8 signs of John, all of which picture the divinity and the power and the miracles of Christ. They're signs of the Messiah. I've given you 8 signs. Write this in John 20. So you'll know that Christ, Jesus is Christ, and he's the Son of God. That's why he writes his book. And he presents to us the picture of Jesus Christ as God. Hey, funny story. Jack shows little boy Taylor. He's about 3. It was in our office. And Glenn and I and some of the guys were there, and Jack says, who's that? He points to Glenn. And that sign headed up to Glenn. Who's that? He points to Derek. And Taylor goes, Derek. Who's that? He points to Gary Schrader. That's Gary. Who's that? He points to me. And Taylor said, God. It was a humbling moment, so we had to straighten him out about a few things. John's going to present Jesus Christ as God. All right? Now, he left his personal signature in John chapter 13. It's in the upper room, and he tells us some things that nobody else ever mentions about. And remember at the Last Supper, they're all sitting there. Here's John's signature. After this, Jesus was troubled in spirit, and Jesus said, one of you is going to betray me. His disciples all stared at each other to know which one he meant. One of them, the disciple whom Jesus loved. And John uses this in reference to himself. He was the closest disciple to Jesus. Was reclining next to Jesus. In fact, the Greek words may indicate he had his head on Jesus' shoulder. And Peter wrote us in the one Jesus loved and whispered, who it is. You know how Peter would do? We want to know who it is. And so John turns to Jesus and says, who is it? And Jesus apparently said very quietly, so that Peter and John were the only ones who heard, the one I take this piece of bread, dump it in the soft ear, and give it to you. That's the warning. Eat. And that's John. John pictures himself at the cross when Jesus was handing away his mother to John to hear him. And what is it? This is the intimacy. The lesson here is the intimacy that John had with Jesus. When you read here, he's the only one who tells us about Jesus being baptized. One of the most intimate moments with Jesus and his Father, when the Father said, this is my boy. I'm pleased with him. Only John tells him. Yeah. Only John tells us about the wedding feast at Cana and the little discussion that goes on between Jesus and his mother Mary. Jesus will fix it, says Mary. Jesus says, no, hold it now. My time hadn't come. It's a little interlude of intimacy. Only John tells us about Nicodemus. We wouldn't know about Nicodemus and how Christ opened up his heart. And then he's the only one who tells us about the woman at the well. We wouldn't know about the woman at the well. What does he do with her? He opens up her heart with intimate moments with the woman at the well. Only he tells us about the man born blind. He's the only one who mentions Lazarus and the resurrection of Lazarus. And wouldn't know those things were not for the Gospel of John. And in each of them, there's the picture then of sitting down at one, at dinner, at Mary Martha's house. And then all of a sudden, Mary's there at his feet worshiping. And only he tells us, he looks at her and she's the only one who figures out I'm going to die. And the intimacy. The lesson of John's life is the intimacy you and I can have with Jesus. Thanks to these Gospels, showed us a different aspect of the transforming life of Jesus Christ. All right? There's Matthew. It gives us the picture. Remember our little chart? Here are the four creatures. We got a lion. This is how John in Revelation even lines it up. We got a lion, we got an ox, we got a man, we got God. Four different faces. And we see King Jesus in Matthew, and the servant Jesus in Mark, and human Jesus in Luke, and divine Jesus in John. So when you're reading the gospel, and as Glenn and I and Jack are preaching and teaching the next year or so on Jesus, these are our major sources. When we go to these doctrines, understand they've got a direction, they've got a theme, they've got a purpose, which unfold to us some of the beauties of Jesus Christ. Now, I told you that every gospel writer has his own lesson in mind. And see, every one of these gospels has its own lesson for life too. I'll mention you. You see, what's the book of Matthew? What's it? Bowing down to King Jesus is to experience the kingdom of Christ on earth. Could you imagine next verse? Where is the king? Jesus said, pray thy will be done, thy kingdom come. Where's the kingdom? Well, one day in eternity we'll all see it, but wait a minute. The kingdom of Christ is wherever Jesus Christ has his influence. And wherever Jesus Christ has influence, the kingdom has come. See, that means at any moment when you and I open up our lives, surrendering to Christ, King, and he has influence in our life and those around us, the kingdom has come upon him. Mark, developing the attitude of a servant is to cultivate the heart of Christ. What is his heart? He's a servant. I came to seek and to save that which is lost. He's the servant. And when you and I are in the process of becoming a servant, we have the very heart of him. Luke, sharing compassion is to express the compassion, the passion of Christ. Jesus said, as you've done it to the least of these, you've done it to me. He was the compassion. And John, recognizing the divinity of Christ, is to enjoy the life of Christ, because only the divine Christ is the one who can come in and dwell in it. Before in the power we need for every single situation. Those are the left that flow to us out of each gospel, that framework, that the context. Gospels give us the mind of Christ. Now, what is the bow heads just for quiet moment? Just want you to imagine a thing or two with me here, with you would. I want you to imagine that the gospel. I want you to imagine bowing yourself down before King. Could you imagine that? Could you imagine that in the surrender to Christ? I don't want to use the word aura as such, as maybe like a glass setting comes down around you and your family. And it's like the kingdom of God has just flowed down all around. Could you imagine that might happen in your life as you bow down? Could you imagine developing the heart of a servant? Could you imagine Jesus taking a towel and washing his disciples' feet? Could you imagine taking a towel and looking at some of the people around you and bowing down to wash their feet? Could you imagine that? Could you imagine the humility of heart here? Could you imagine seeing people with compassion, the down and out and the hurting and the struggling? Could you imagine seeing people with a heart of compassion and realizing as you and I minister to their needs, it's like a very passionate body? Could you imagine that flowing into your life? Could you imagine raising your hands in worship to the divine Jesus Christ, and then maybe bowing down with your face to the ground to worship him in tongue? And then, if you imagine that same Jesus Christ coming to live in tongue, looking at his, Father, thank you for giving and preserving the gospel records. I was just thinking, thank you that in John, Jesus told us, Lord, this is so assuring for us, that Jesus told us that when the gospel writers wrote their books, you would help bring everything to remembrance. Thank you for doing that. Thank you for putting that verse in. We don't have to wonder whether these guys got it right or not. Lord, you gave us a word from Jesus. He would indwell them and help them. That is so helpful. Okay. Would you take us from this place as always to live out this the life of Jesus? And with the Bible class is starting in a moment for all of us. If you don't know where to go, the folks on the plaza will help you. If you'd like to become a Christian or be baptized, folks over there at the prayer ministry room will help you. And if you're a gift and it's your first time here, you brought a gift, I'd like to meet you. I'll be standing here front. Come by and say hello. May God bless us this week. Have a wonderful week, and we'll worship with you.